The moment of truth in any survival situation doesn't arrive with a bang. It arrives with a sudden, chilling realization. For Elias Vance, it arrived in a blinding horizontal sheet of mountain rain that turned his world to gray. He had been hiking the northern ridge, a simple day trip, just him, a water bottle, and the flimsy windbreaker jacket he now knew was useless. But the storm wasn't in the forecast. It hit with the brutal speed of a predator, dropping the temperature by 30 degrees in minutes and soaking him to the bone. Elias stumbled, his foot catching on a moss-covered root. He went down hard, the impact knocking the air from his lungs. For a single, terrifying second, the only sound was the roar of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain on the sodden earth. He pushed himself up, his muscles already starting to tremble. This wasn't just discomfort, this was the first stage of hypothermia. The clock had started. Think about it. In a matter of hours, this storm, this unforgiving wilderness, would turn his body into an enemy, stealing his core heat until his mind shut down. His pack, his tools, his precious lighter, they were all gone, swept away when he'd slid down a muddy embankment. He had nothing. No knife. No cordage. No fire starter. No tarp. He was alone in the cold, wet, and surrounded by nothing but nature's brutal indifference. His mind flashed back to the survival rule of threes. You can survive 3 minutes without air, 3 hours without shelter in extreme conditions, and 3 days without water. He was already 30 minutes past soaked. He had maybe 2 hours left before shivering turned to staggering, and staggering turned to stillness. But Elias Vance was not just a hiker. He was a man who understood the fundamental, timeless law of the wilderness. The earth provides. The true test of a survivor is not what tools you bring into the woods, but what you can create with what the woods gives you. The most crucial tool, the only tool that matters right now, is your mind. And his mind was screaming one word: shelter. But how do you build a shelter? One that can keep out driving rain and hold precious body heat, when your hands are empty. You don't need an axe to build a fortress. You need ancient knowledge. You need the single greatest survival hack known to man, the debris hut. Elias pushed himself off the wet ground. He looked around him, scanning the forest not for a way out, but for raw materials. The trees, the deadfall, the forest floor, they were no longer obstacles. They were a hardware store, a fabric mill, and an insulation factory all rolled into one. The build begins now. The first 5 minutes are the most important. They are the transition from victim to victor. He gave himself just 5 minutes to complete phase 1, site selection and anchor. The biggest mistake a desperate person makes is building the first thing they see. That's a death sentence. Elias ignored the tempting overhang of a cliff face. It could be unstable and the runoff would pool at the entrance. He ignored the base of the lone, towering pine, a widowmaker ready to drop a massive branch in a high wind. He needed a spot that satisfied 3 non-negotiable criteria, and he needed to find it in the swirling chaos of the storm. High ground but protected. He spotted a gentle, sloping ridge near a cluster of old-growth cedar. The slope meant water wouldn't pool beneath him, and the cedars offered natural windbreak. This was critical. Sleeping in a puddle is a fast track to hypothermia. Protection from overhead and wind. The cedars offered natural protection from the north wind, the primary direction of the storm. He wanted the shelter's entrance facing away from the prevailing wind. This is the toolless secret. A shelter requires an enormous amount of insulation. The best site is an area rich with dead leaves, pine needles, and easy-to-reach deadfall. He targeted a spot next to a patch of dry, fluffy pine needles under the boughs of a large spruce, a ready-made mattress. With the site chosen, a small level patch nestled between 2 large living trees, Elias moved to the next step, the structure's backbone, the ridgepole. This is the central support beam that determines the size and strength of the entire shelter. Since he had no axe, no saw, and no cordage, traditional methods were out. He needed a natural fork or brace. He walked toward a downed tree, a thick, fallen log perhaps 20 feet long. It was too heavy to lift, but it was his source. He didn't need the whole log. He needed one straight, sturdy limb, a branch roughly the diameter of his forearm and 8 to 10 feet long. Finding a perfectly straight, loose branch is rare. So he had to apply toolless wood-breaking leverage. He found a dead spruce limb still attached to the log. It was dry and brittle but stubbornly held. 1. Elias didn't try to rip the branch off. Instead he found a rough, sharp rock, a piece of flinty, igneous stone. Using the rock's edge like a hammer and chisel, he battered a small notch into the base of the branch, right where it met the main log. This took time, 10 minutes of patient, brutal work, but the goal was not to cut, but to weaken and create a fault line. 2. Once the notch was deep enough to show bare wood, he inserted a smaller, thicker piece of dead wood, a lever, into the notch. 3. He anchored the main log with his foot and pressed down on the lever, using the ground as a fulcrum. The tension built until, with a sharp crack, the branch snapped cleanly along the weakened notch. He had his ridgepole, 8 feet long, straight and strong. The most stable structure in nature is the triangle. His debris hut would be an elongated A-frame, built low to the ground to conserve heat. He only needed the shelter to be slightly wider than his shoulders and just long enough for his body. The smaller the volume, the easier it is for his body heat to warm the interior. He carried the ridgepole back to his chosen site. 1. He located a small Y-shaped branch fork on one of the living cedar trees. This natural cradle would serve as the headboard. It was approximately 3 feet off the ground, the perfect height for a low, thermally efficient shelter. 2. Elias lifted the thick end of the ridgepole and settled it into the natural Y-fork. 3. At the foot end, the pole rested on the ground. To secure it, he didn't use rope. He used weight and terrain. He used his hands to dig a shallow depression, a foot-long furrow, in the earth at the pole's tip. He placed the pole into the furrow and piled heavy stones and logs on either side and over the end. This simple deadman anchor prevents the pole from sliding sideways or lifting. The resulting structure was a long, low A-frame skeleton. The ridgepole was stable, anchored high at the head and low at the feet. This was the difference between a temporary lean-to and a robust, life-saving shelter. The core structure was complete and he was ready for the next phase. To create hundreds of diagonal spokes, rafters, that lean against the ridgepole, forming the walls of the hut. Using the kick-break technique on pencil-thin dead branches. Snap branches by placing them against a stationary log and kicking down sharply. The narrative focuses on the rhythm of gathering, the need for speed, and the growing pile of materials. Placing the rafters close together, every 6 to 8 inches, to ensure no insulation falls through. The importance of the angle, too steep and the debris slides off, too shallow and the roof leaks. To create a lattice layer over the rafters to hold the fine insulation material. Weaving fine, pliable vines, e.g. honeysuckle, wild grape, or long, thin branches between the rafters horizontally. This forms a net that prevents the leaves and needles from falling into the sleeping area. Elias's growing fatigue, the realization that he is now working with the forest, not against it. The most critical step. A debris hut requires a minimum of 12 to 18 inches of compacted, insulating material on all sides. This includes the floor, walls, and roof. Prioritize the best materials. Dry pine needles, dead and fluffy leaves, oak or maple are best, or dried grass. Avoid green or wet material. The narrative details Elias shaking the needles and leaves to trap maximum air pockets. Air is the true insulator. Starting from the bottom of the walls and layering the debris upwards, overlapping like shingles. Packing the material down constantly to increase density and thermal mass. Applying an outer layer of bark, large leaves, if available, or thick, mossy clumps over the debris. This shingles the outer layer, diverting rain away from the inner, insulating layer. The narrative stresses the patient, meticulous nature of this work, contrasting it with the desperate speed of the earlier phases. The biggest heat loss is to the cold ground. Elias must build a ground mattress that is at least 2 feet thick, uncompacted. Piling the fluffiest, driest material inside the shelter. Once Elias lies down, this layer must still maintain a depth of 6 to 8 inches to properly insulate him from the earth. Elias finally slides into the shelter. The silence inside, contrasted with the still roaring storm outside. The entrance is the thermal weak point. He constructs a plug, a heavy bundle of debris tied together with strong, flexible vines or saplings. Pulling the debris plug into the opening, sealing himself inside. The air temperature inside immediately stabilizing from the wind chill outside. The shelter is a success. Elias is warm, dry, and safe. He has beaten the 3-hour rule. The narrative concludes with Elias reflecting on the true lesson. Survival isn't about expensive gear. It's about the knowledge to substitute a knife with a rock, rope with a vine, and a tent with a pile of leaves. The true ultimate survival hack is realizing that in the wilderness, everything is a tool, and you are the master craftsman. If this story taught you that a tool-less situation is still a solvable situation, hit that like button. Subscribe for more stories that break down the world's most critical survival hacks. Share this with anyone who thinks a weekend trip to the woods requires a $1,000 gear list. Your mind is the ultimate survival tool. Never leave home without it.